But I was talking with someone recently who said that the Indigenous are one of the founding peoples of Canada, or one of the, I think that was the language he used. Like, they are part of the fabric of this nation, of this country, from the beginning. And I had to differ with him. I said, with all due respect to the Indigenous people, they were not one of the founding nations of Canada, although they certainly interacted with the early settlers and Europeans who came here. But the founding peoples were the French and the British, meaning the English and the Scottish originally. So first I'll provide a short answer as to why the Indigenous aren't the founding nation of Canada, and then the rest of this video will be a longer answer. So the short answer is that they didn't build the roads and build the cities and develop the economy. They didn't have the numbers, really, to compare to the European settlers, who vastly outnumbered them very soon. They had a different culture which was not continued. It was not a Christian culture. They fought us. How would you make an enemy a founding nation of your I mean, not all of them fought us. They cooperated with some of us. But generally, their culture was not exactly working with us. So it's absurd to say that another people you're competing with, and you had to take land from them, for better or for worse. How on earth could they therefore be a founding nation of your people? It doesn't make sense. There was no continuation from that old native world. The natives that exist today, they do hold some of their native traditions, but they have largely assimilated into North American Canadian society, and that's a good thing. And the English and Scottish came here later than the French, and you could even still say that those are two different peoples. Like, do you really believe that one nation can be bicultural? I mean, not really, but in the sense that we share the same realm, economic links, governmental links, that sort of basic linkage. That was created in the 1790s when Upper Canada, which became the province of Ontario, when that was settled by an initial wave of thousands and thousands of loyalists from the American colonies who remained loyal to King George. That together with the pre-existing colony of Quebec, which had been conquered by the British and their colonist allies in 1759, the city of Quebec, and then Montreal followed, and that was pretty much New France had fallen into the hands of the British. But so it had only been a few decades. They'd had the Americans Revolution in the 1770s and 1780s, and then by the 1790s these loyalists start coming over, and some late loyalists too, who weren't really that sincere about their loyalty to King George, but they were willing to buy the land, but they were English speaking, from generally a Protestant background, whereas the French were Catholic and from a French background. And because the English had initially been outnumbered by the French subjects in New France that they were now controlling, they let the French keep their customs, keep their religion, and that's why you can argue that they were a founding people, the French, and they were here since the 17th century. They explored, like I showed in my previous video, that the French had a trading outpost down by the lake in downtown Toronto, Fort Rouillé, and that was just one among many of the French trading networks that expanded all through the continent. They didn't go to the West Coast, but they certainly all went down to the Gulf of Mexico. But they didn't settle here in such large numbers like the English did, and the Scotch, or Scottish. And then later, not really the Irish, because the Irish came in the potato famine, but that was already the 1840s. So you'd already had at least 2 or 3 solid generations of English and Scottish people settling here. They're the ones who cleared the land. They were the pioneers. There's a distinction between pioneers, settlers, and immigrants, albeit a bit of a gray line between them, because where does one become a settler? But still, you can recognize from an aerial perspective looking down, figuratively speaking, you can recognize, okay, yeah, obviously an immigrant, that's someone who comes many generations later, once the infrastructure is established. Like the people that came in the 20th century. Like my own grandpa, Robert, he was an immigrant. There's nothing wrong or shameful about being an immigrant, but the pioneers are the ones who came first. They fought with bears and, maybe not all the time, but they cut down the trees and pulled up tree stumps. The roads were mud. It was a rough life. The men had to be strong. Women had to be a little tough too. And so they really laid out the foundation, culturally speaking, continuing the English language, continuing some form of Christianity, albeit, there are the effects of the Protestant Reformation. Things are starting to lose that sort of institutional. It wasn't Europe. It wasn't like where one country is going to be one religion. This is the New World. But still, that fabric was still there. This is not something that the indigenous people participated in. We can respect these people. They're formidable enemies. We often competed with them. There weren't as many indigenous people here as there were in the U.S., what became the U.S., because that was where, there were more game and more farmland down there. And the indigenous practiced some agriculture. They did have cornfields or maize, I would say, and they didn't really raise too many animals. They might have raised some animals, but nothing like a cow or pigs. They didn't have those in the New World. They might have had turkeys. And, they grew squash and beans. So they had some agriculture, but it was not, they were still more of a hunter-gatherer people, at least here in north of Lake Ontario. So it wasn't like this European agriculture being introduced. I'm not saying a people is defined necessarily just by their agriculture or their technology. Like a lot of white nationalists, I'm not necessarily a white nationalist, but I'm a race realist. And I believe in history, the importance of that. But a lot of the white nationalists might have said, we're so great because we had the scientific revolution and we had machine guns, and like clearly it's like I don't view technology as the one standard to say that, therefore our people deserve to take this land. I view it more in Christian terms, and not necessarily one's better or the other, but we're different, and you can recognize like a different founding people. Because it would have been obviously very different, like before the Europeans came here. It obviously would have been very different. There was no idea of a geopolitical entity here, like 300 years ago, that would have corresponded to anything like the modern geopolitical entity of Canada today. Because the indigenous peoples were different tribes spread over such a wide area, so there wouldn't have been the same boundaries. They would have shared links with peoples farther south of us. This land, where Toronto is today, would have changed hands between the Six Nations or Iroquois and the Hurons or Ojibwe peoples. They would have fought each other. They would have been enemies. They often committed many barbarities. Not that Europeans couldn't do barbaric things too, but I mean, generally you could classify the Europeans as Christian, of course, and the indigenous you could classify them as pagan. In some ways, they shared certain similarities with European pagans, like they would have had something like medicine men or shamans or witch doctors, something like that. They probably would have taken some psychedelic substances, and I'm speaking extremely generally, but they worshipped and believed in animal spirits and a certain, you might call like different gods or different nature forces, which is, that's similar to a polytheistic system. So in that sense, maybe you can say we're falling back into a non-Christian society today, but by that standard, certainly there was a break. There was something very new in the New World, and I'm not pessimistic about the settlement of the New World. I view it as a good thing. There was certainly God's hand involved in the settlement of North America by the Europeans. So I'm not necessarily saying one people is good or bad or the other, but we can recognize there's nothing wrong with recognizing that, yes, it was in English, Scottish, and French, if you will. It's sort of a bicultural system, even though that doesn't work. This is a particular situation of Canada. That's how it was at the beginning. We can respect the Indians or the indigenous because, they fought us and they knew the land very well, but eventually we outnumbered them and we did have better technology, although I'm not saying that, technology is the sole measure of man. I'm not saying that, because now we're in the multicultural way of thinking, or not all of us, but that's what they try to push on us. So if you're just going to open the whole cultural mythos to everyone, and then it just becomes meaningless. It just becomes complete, or they can just use it for whatever purpose they want. Like if you're going to accept the indigenous as a founding people of Canada, along with the French and British, then why wouldn't you accept also the Chinese who came in the 19th century to build the railroads? Because they did come in the thousands, and not all of them left. I mean, they were largely kept out for decades by people like John A. Macdonald and the legislation to prohibit Chinese immigration. But still, there was a presence that made their way in there. They were never fully ever, deported or anything. And then, of course, once the 20th century progressed, eventually there would be further Asian immigration. So the Asians, using this logic that the indigenous people, and I mean, there's even a relation between the indigenous and Asians, but I don't think, maybe they wouldn't like to talk about that. But it's, I mean, they are genetically related, but obviously they're different peoples. But so why wouldn't you just say, oh well, then the Chinese, they're also a founding people of Canada? I mean, this would just move into pure absurdity. So that's why we have to be comfortable drawing boundaries. There's nothing wrong with delineating certain boundaries. You just do it in a respectful way with people. You're not trying to deliberately offend people, but this is part of what it is to be masculine, to be a man. You have to draw boundaries. You have to say, this is where one thing starts, and this is where another thing begins. So I finished filming, and then I was thinking, oh, I should probably make another point, which is that what I described, how I clearly explained that the English, Scottish, and French were the founding peoples of Canada. Someone could say, oh, well, so what? That soon changed. I mean, so what? That was over 200 years ago. Well, yeah, but what they laid in place, their genetic group, their language, I mean English or French in the respective cases, but really English for the whole rest of Canada as the West was settled. That, the sort of Christian cultural framework we've been talking about, that stayed in place for, roughly 200 years, and depending on where a place was settled. I mean, obviously Quebec was settled much more earlier than the West was. But there was really little change in Canada demographically or culturally until like the middle of the 20th century. And in terms of mass immigration, not really until the 1970s and 80s did we really start to see the kind of mass immigration which really would change a culture. Now, obviously, as I've mentioned, there's other things that can change a culture, but demographics is clearly one of the most important things. So what we are living in now is, in fact, a radical change from at least 200 years of what Canada was since its creation, since there ever has been anything known as Canada. And I don't even know if you could call what we're living in now Canada. It should have a different name. Hasta luego, amigos.